Good morning. I'm Brandy Stitt with the Women's Business Center. Welcome to our Women's Wednesday Entrepreneur Education Series. This for the next 2 weeks, and previously we were focusing on leadership as our primary topics. And today we're very excited to have Danielle Bearden with Lever One joining us again. We have been recording our sessions, and we will be recording this webinar again as well. All of our webinars are posted on our YouTube channel. So if you missed last week's session on emotional intelligence, I will share the YouTube channel link in the chat box so you can revisit that session. We do have that posted, and we will also post today's recording on our YouTube channel as well. So today we will focus on interpersonal communication. Next week's session on May 26th will be vulnerability in leadership. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for next week's session as well. So once again, we will be posting the recording of today's session. Feel free to use the chat or Q&A if you have questions for Danielle. We will be monitoring that throughout so that she can help address any questions that you have. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Danielle Bearden with Lever One.
Yes, thank you so much. We're happy to be a part of the second series of 3 again this morning, and are eager to talk a little bit more about these topics in leadership. And many surveys have shown still that the emotional intelligence component is or EQ as we refer to it, is even more increasingly important than IQ when it comes to leadership roles. And so as we continue to work in such circumstances like the pandemic and intricate situations, these continue to be on the forefront of topics. And so today, as our second series, we're going to be really deep diving into interpersonal communications and leadership. And Michelle, I'll let you go ahead and share the slides. So again, the purpose of today is really just differentiating between positive and negative interpersonal skills in a variety of workplace settings. You can go to the next slide, Michelle. Again, my name is Danielle Bearden. I'm the Director of Human Resources for Lever One. We are a local based PEO, which is a professional employer organization, servicing nearly almost 5,000 staff members in all 50 states. We're super proud of that. We're fully accredited, and we're Kansas City based. So as we move along, I do oversee the human resources component and initiative here at Lever One. So when we talk about interpersonal communication, what is it? And some people are like, that's a fancy way of saying that you're talking to somebody. Interpersonal communication is really the process by which people exchange information, maybe feelings and meaning through verbal and nonverbal communications. So essentially what it is, it's face-to-face communication. What we know about interpersonal communication is that 90% of the message that we receive from one another when we are face-to-face is through nonverbal messages. So how many of you have often heard someone say, it's not what you said, it's how you said it, right? I know I've been guilty of hearing that from time to time. And really, how it is said in the nonverbal messages sent through your tone of voice, your facial expressions, your gestures, and your body language really help define the message you're trying to send. So without speech, an observer really can be using cues such as what's your posture like? What's your facial expression? Are you making eye contact? And such of those nonverbals, no matter how subtle or unintentional they may be. But when we really focus on the elements of interpersonal communication, we kind of break it down into these 6 components. We've got the communicators, the message, noise, feedback, context, and channel. And this seems like a lot, but we're really going to break it down today as far as, as a leader, what that looks like. And really a lot of research has been done to try to break down interpersonal communication into these number of elements in order so that we can easily understand it and then apply it. So when we talk about the communicators, this is really involving the two people that are face-to-face communicating, again, including verbal and nonverbal. So for any communication, there has to be two people, right? Easy to think about involving a sender and receiver of the message. The sender is the one speaking, the receiver is the one listening. And communications are almost always super complex. They're two-way processes. People are sending and receiving messages. And again, keep in mind that the receiver may perceive your communication differently than you intend. And how do we work through that? Really listening as we look to send that feedback in the form of smiles, maybe head nods, etc. But the communicators are what we refer to as the two people involved in the conversation or the communication that's happening. Then we talk about the message. Message not only means the speech used or your information that you're trying to convey, but it's also the nonverbal messages exchanged, such as facial expressions, tone of voice, those elements that I had previously touched on. But some components of nonverbals that I touch on as a leader, for example, is when we have employees or staff that may come to our office or may be sitting at a desk. Many of us may have chairs in which can be moved. It can be raised, it can be lowered. One simple thing I do as a nonverbal message that I'm exchanging to either the receiver or the sender is adjusting my chair so that I am at eye level in the same height as the receiver. This tells the receiver that I'm on an even playing field, so to speak, and I'm even to you, and I want to listen. I'm neither above or below you. I'm with you. And so when we talk about nonverbals, how much of that sometimes we don't even think about. Another form of nonverbal cues or message that I try to send is through eye contact and an active listening. So how many of us have iWatches or smart watches, if you will? And sometimes we'll be guilty of feeling it go off or hearing it go off and want to look at it in the middle of a conversation in which maybe someone's speaking. That gives the perception to that individual that maybe we're not really listening to them, actively listening, right? So those are some, in addition, nonverbal messages that I really look at. And crossing your arms is another one. When you are being either the communicator or the receiver, or the sender, the receiver rather, when you have your arms crossed as a leader, sometimes that tells our receivers we're of authority. We don't really, are not maybe open to listening to them. So the simple uncrossing of your arms is also another great nonverbal message to send that I am genuinely interested in what you're saying. So speaking effectively is a component of the message, and it's really defined in such a way as your message is clearly heard and our goal is that it's acted upon, right? So two main elements of speaking effectively is truly what you say and how you say it. So what you say means just what it is, your choice of words. The words you might use when chatting to a friend are likely going to be quite different from those used in a formal presentation or an interview. Similarly, the way that you speak will also vary in different situations. So there's going to be likely some common factors. For example, whether you naturally talk quiet or you talk loudly, how you use your body language. When you are sending this message, you want to say it in such a way that your overall intent is really what we're going towards. So whether you're talking to a major conference or about a new scientific discovery, or maybe about your children, about their behavior, you need to be able to speak effectively. And some elements of effective speaking that we examine, and you'll see in these slides here, the words you use, your voice, and your nonverbals, particularly speaking your body language as we reviews. So your audience is one that you certainly want to consider. You can go to the next slide, Michelle. So the words you choose will be certainly different if you're talking to 200 people, a trusted colleague, your best friend, or if you're talking to 10. So really think about your audience overall level of understanding and keeping it easy, keeping it simple. Shorter sentences always create an urgency, but simpler words are just easier to understand. So if you cannot explain something in simple terms, you probably haven't understood it yourself. And I want to touch too on regional and ethnic accents. Those are all part of individual personality, and they do add that unique element to the way that you speak. And they may also, in some situations, create that potential barrier in communications. So for example, if you have, let's say, a strong accent, people from another area or country may find it harder to understand what you are saying. So you might need to slow down, slow your speech, really ensure that they have time to process what you're saying. So this is all, again, part of knowing your audience. And it's worth remembering the words are only a part of your overall communication and message. When we look at your voice can truly reveal as much about your personal history as your appearance can. And so the sound of your voice and the content of your speech are going to be able to provide those clues to an individual's emotional state. You can move to the next slide, Michelle. For example, before we go into noise, if your self-esteem is low, you are likely going to reflect this in your voice. You might be hesitant. You might be quietly speaking. For someone who is confident, however, you might be more likely to have a command to your voice, right? And clarity of speech. And the receiver notices these things. So if you are noticing that you are struggling in any of these areas with your message when it comes to your voice, one of my recommendations is really taking the time to improve your command over your voice and record it. I don't know if any of you have tried this. However, I'd highly recommend it. Recording your own voice in a total informal setting. Maybe you're at home or somewhere quiet in your car. Read a passage, read an article, something out of a newspaper, magazine, or what have you, and then play it back to yourself, right? Listen carefully to how you sound so that you can become accustomed to your own voice. And you might also note that any aspects of your speech will reduce the overall effectiveness of your message. So if there are portions of your speech that you notice you're hesitant on, or you're not conveying your knowledge or confidence of, the overall message and effectiveness of your speech might be a little lackadaisical. So for example, when we're speaking, we might use a lot of ums or slur. I'm one that when I'm speaking, for example, sometimes I really try to watch my like what I mean is so the receiver in that area is going to have a little bit of doubt in your message, you know, and I'll guarantee you, you're not going to like the sound of your recorded voice. Most of us don't. In the same way that some of us don't like photographs of ourselves, it's going to be the same way that you're listening to yourself speak. And then your initial reaction, in most cases, sometimes will be, do I really sound like that? Like, oh my gosh, because I certainly have had experiences with that, but it really sets the stage to develop a better understanding of your voice. And as a leader, that's the number one factor in the message you're sending. So if you are sending an authoritative message in your voice and you really sound firm, that employee is likely going to feel like, wow, I maybe don't feel like they're actively listening to me. Maybe I don't feel like I can really be honest and transparent in communication that I'm trying to convey back to the sender. I say this a lot Employees want to feel one of three things. I said it the first session, I'll say it again. They want to feel either valued, heard, or a part of something, or sometimes one of all three. And typically when there is these interpersonal communications going on, we have to be able to understand the emotion sometimes behind the problem. And the message that we're sending and relaying has to be in alignment with what they're feeling. That's why we reviewed emotional intelligence prior to this session. But really, sometimes we have to address the emotion before we can even apply to the problem and get to that as well. So something to think of certainly as you move along as a leader in your communication style. So an exercise too to help develop your effective speaking skills is to read it a third time, read that article a third time and record your voice, slow down, keep your head up. I'm doing it now physically, like as I'm trying to explain it. Keep your head up. Try not to tuck your chin into your book as you're reading. Hold your book higher. Why do we hold our heads up? Is to project the message that we're trying to send. And pause. It's okay to pause. Let the end of a sentence or the end of a paragraph give you the chance to rest. And pauses can be useful. They can provide that emphasis. So for example, when I'm going to be talking to a staff member, I'm going to be saying, you know, our policy really looks at the importance of attendance and punctuality. Pause. That gives them that emphasis on what you just said, right? So if we practice these little exercises in our message, our interpersonal communications are going to continue to improve. Anyone can improve the sound of their voice, the way they speak, in a matter of days with a few simple exercises like the one I just gave you. So you just have to have that level of commitment and practice a few minutes, and really it's worth it, right? It's totally worth it so that your message is conveyed following your pure intentions. So what do we mean by noise? It's a component of interpersonal communication. It's really a lot of things, but essentially it's anything that can distort your message that you're trying to send. It could be physical noise, so background sounds, a low-flying jet plane. I know we get those here. We're situated by the river market, but also right by an airport. So we get those low-flying jet planes a lot. And that's physical noise for sure for me. But they interfere with the communication. And when we look at other factors of noise, those can frequently be complicated jargon. Like if you're going to use maybe different terms for the context of what you're trying to explain. Inattention, maybe your disinterest, that's noise. Your body language that's not showing you're actively listening, that's noise. And cultural differences can also be considered noise when we look at them in the context of interpersonal communication. So in other words, truly any distortions, inconsistencies that occur while you're trying to send your message. So there are many reasons why interpersonal communications may fail, right? It could be the message, again, what is said, maybe not received exactly the way the sender intended. Maybe the skills of active listening, clarification, and reflection truly can help build that communicator. Also need to be aware of the barriers, that noise. And we look at common barriers of these effective communications in noise. Overcomplicated and unfamiliar or technical terms truly can be noise. If you overcomplicate something, or if you overcomplicate a message, or you just keep on talking and talking and talking, most likely the receiver is going to sit there and zone out. They're going to zone out. Keep it simple. Some people also may find it difficult to express their emotions in some topics because they think they might be off limits or taboo, right? And so some of those topics may include politics, religion, disability, maybe mental or physical abilities, disabilities, any opinion that may seem unpopular. That's another barrier. That's part of this noise, the emotional barriers and the tattoos. So how I had just said, sometimes to get to the bottom of a real problem first with one of your staff members, you have to be able to recognize the emotion behind the problem. So if someone's super sad, or if someone's mad, or if someone's going through something on a personal note, maybe something in their home life, and you recognize through your EQ that that individual is having a hard time, it's probably not going to be the best time to approach maybe a dissatisfactory behavior or dissatisfactory productivity levels at that point. Why? Because they won't hear you. They're likely going to be thinking of everything else that's going on in their brain besides what you're trying to speak to them about. So identifying the emotion, taking care of that, and then schedule a time to review the actual problem. There's always going to be differences in perceptions and viewpoints. I like to say a lot and very frequently, people's perceptions are truly their reality. And the more we as leaders adopt that and understand that, we can be more open to how our receivers are receiving our message. And then we can be certainly more reflective of how we're giving our message, right? So when knowing that perception is their reality, we can take ownership as leaders of how we phrased our message. We could have been more clear. Maybe we had too much noise going on. Maybe we weren't really attentive. Let's take some ownership of where we can improve our communications as leaders for betterment of the organization in itself. Language differences, difficulty in understanding unfamiliar accents are all things that are part of this noise. And the skilled communicator has to be aware of these barriers and try to truly reduce their impact. Continually check and understand and offer appropriate feedback. And this is where your emotional intelligence, again, or your EQ is going to come into play here. Because if you can't have communication, you can't have a relationship, right? And if you can't have a relationship, you're not going to have respect. And so if you don't have respect, those employees are not going to be able to follow your lead. So all of this is like a domino effect. And so why we're talking about, again, the communication part today. Feedback should be all the time. I'm a huge believer of that. Someone should never be surprised when you come to them with a problem or an issue and you haven't spoken with them about it. But what feedback is, before I go into that, is truly messages the receiver returns, which allows the sender to know how accurately the message has been received. That's super complicated. But again, what it's saying is, I'm taking the time to talk to you about this particular policy and I'm not satisfied with it. Let's work together so that we can overcome this. Or it's the range from verbal statements that will say, I'm sorry, can you say that again? I don't understand. So when we are trying to understand too, on the flip side of our staff members, this is the time in which we do it. This is the feedback process. Subtle facial expressions or changes in posture might indicate truly that the sender and the receiver feel uncomfortable with the message. It allows the sender to regulate, really adapt. In life, as much as in work, it's important to know how to provide this feedback to others, not only effectively, but constructively, without causing the offense there. So with the many opportunities in life for providing others with feedback, really being able to frequently note that this could be called encouragement feedback, the yes, I'm listening, the right? It's a collaborative back and forth purpose. So the areas that are within your power are what you want to look at as a leader and when we're talking about feedback. You have absolutely no control over whether the recipient chooses to act upon your feedback or not. So I always say, let's put that to the side. So in general, what I mean is our actions as leaders cannot waver, cannot change because of the actions of our staff members. We have to be the streamlined, consistent, calm, cool, professional, pleasant, right? But how are we going to make sure our feedback is effective? When we give feedback, how are we going to make sure that that employee knows what we mean, receives it how we intend it, and it's never a surprise when we go to approach it for the next time? So number one, and I think you can move to the next slide, Michelle, feedback should be about behavior and not personality. This is where I say separate the problem from the person. For example, we might say, oh, I can't stand Bob because Bob is always late. What we should really say is, I can't stand the lateness. It's affecting productivity, and I'm going to approach it. It's separating the problem from the person. And this is probably the most important rule of feedback. It has no bearing on what type of person they may be, or what they believe, or what they value. You are only commenting on behaviors, conduct, performance, productivity, not the person. So number one rule, has nothing to do with the person or nor their personality, has everything to do with behavior, performance standards, and such. Feedback should describe the effect of the person's behavior on you. And I always like to say this as leaders, if you can't bring it full circle for that staff member to truly understand how being late, for example, affects the whole organization, they're likely not going to really catch on. So for example, if you say, Bob, your punctuality and your tardiness is against policy, I need you to correct it. Bob's likely going to say, yeah, okay. And then maybe they are late again tomorrow. As a leader, bringing it full circle, for example, would be saying, hey, Bob, your deficiencies in being late and being tardy are excessive, and they affect our organization. What happens when you're tardy and you're late is that the projects you were assigned are assigned to then a colleague or a coworker. And then those colleagues or that coworkers' projects are delayed. What happens then is that we don't meet our project deadline, and we don't get our revenue, and we lose our money, and we're not as profitable as we once thought. And then we might even lose our respect, our brand recognition. That is an example of what I'm talking about. Describe the effect the person's behavior has on you, on the company as a whole. It's a blame-free one, and therefore it's much more acceptable, generally speaking, but it's bringing it full circle so that Bob knows, for example, how it affects everything, totally gets it, right? So choose your feedback language carefully. Useful phrases that I always recommend for giving this feedback might include, when you did this, then this was a result, or this happened. I noticed that when you said this, it made me feel as if this, and walk me through that. Or I really liked the way you did this, and particularly the way you went about it. And again, I like to end these feedback opportunities with, walk me through why that action was taken. Because it gives the employee, the staff member, the receiver, if you will, the opportunity for you to listen to what they were thinking, so that you can work together on correcting that. You can go to the next slide. Be as specific as possible. And this is way important when things are not going well, right? We all know it's super tempting to say everything, you always, and really avoid that as a leader. You want to be specific. On this day, you didn't meet this goal. on this day, you didn't do this. So I want to work with you and provide you the feedback that I was dissatisfied, and this needs to improve, right? So being as specific as possible. And it should always be timely. It's no good telling someone something that offended or pleased you or didn't meet standards 6 months later. I call this our window of opportunity. And one action I tend to recommend for leaders to make sure that, I mean, we don't have time to not have time, but we as leaders sometimes are guilty of saying, oh my gosh, I'm so busy. I don't have time to deal with this right now. Here's what you do. This again is a recommendation. Let's say we're still talking about Bob and his punctuality or lack thereof. But we are super busy that day and we have projects and we have deadlines and other items to discuss and ascertain. So we'll look at Bob and we'll have a quick conversation with Bob and we'll say, hey, Bob, I noticed that you were late again today. I just want to let you know that I'm aware of that. I know we've discussed this in the past. I don't have the time that I want to give to this situation today, but I do want to speak with you about this later in the week. What does that do? It makes it so that you put a bookmark there to let Bob know you've noticed. It's still going to be timely so that everyone can still remember what happened. And then you can get on, give the feedback, move forward, but it's your place saver. It's your bookmark, if you will, so that you can still accomplish in your window of opportunity as a leader, and you don't let something just continue to go on and you don't approach it. And pick your moment. I had already really talked about. It's being able to use your EQ to notice when people are open to receiving this feedback and when they may not be. This is so super crucial. So this is why I say EQ sometimes is even more important than IQ, because you have to be able to know when people are open to receiving, like what verbals or non-verbals are they giving you to be able to recognize. For example, like I said, the angry staff member coming into the office. I'm likely not going to give you feedback in that moment because you're probably not going to hear much of what I have to say, right? So every interaction is an opportunity for feedback in both directions. Some of the most important feedback may happen casually, and it could be in a quick exchange. Like, for example, let's say, you remind me of my mom, and someone says, really, why? And she gets really snappy with me when she's stressed too. And oh gosh, thanks for telling me, and I'm sorry that you witnessed that. That was example of casual. I really hope that doesn't happen, but personality conflict certainly does in the workplace. But to be recognized that not everyone should ever work or will ever work with someone who's the same. So having been made aware of that behavior, choosing to change it, casually or not, that feedback happens, and it happens all the time. And it was specific and it was timely in that short amount of time of that informal example. You can move to the next slide. And before going into the context, I forgot, I did want to mention one more thing. Be open to the feedback, because a lot of times as leaders, there's going to be times where we have to be humble, right? Putting some humility back in our positions. So in order to hear the feedback, you need to listen to it. You don't think that we are all high and mighty and no one's perfect. And really just listen and notice that nonverbal communication as well. Listen to what they're saying as well as what they aren't, and be open to receiving that feedback. And lastly, when we talk about context, well, almost close to last, I should say, it's the communication that's influenced by the context in which it takes place. So it's apart from looking at the situational context of where the interaction takes place, for example. The social context also needs to be considered. For example, the roles, responsibilities, relative status of the participants, really the emotional climate, the participants' expectations of the interaction. They will all also affect the communication as a whole. And channel is the message being transferred from one to another. It's that face-to-face channel used in speech, vision, during a telephone conversation. Let's say, for example, during the pandemic, most of our channels are virtual. Tell me that doesn't really add a challenge to the message that we're trying to send, because they can't see our nonverbals. And again, our nonverbals equate to almost 90% of the message that the receiver is getting from you. And for example, if the telephone conversation is limited to your speech only, boy, your voice better be what you need it to be as a leader, right? Which is why we reviewed that earlier. We have to account for the channels and how those are going to affect the overall receipt of the message. So in ending, lastly, my final recommendation is, if you have time, take 5 minutes to observe communication in your workplace. Make a mental note, right, of behaviors. Like, watch some of the staff, make mental note of how their behaviors are, what nonverbals they're using toward one another, what verbals are they using. Think about, okay, who are the communicators? What messages are they exchanging? You know, what's the noise that I'm seeing that's distorting the message? How is this feedback being given from one to the other? What's the context? You'll probably, to be honest, you probably do this all the time subconsciously, but when you actively observe this, you can more really fully appreciate its mechanics and interpersonal relations by observing those others. It really provides that opportunity for you to develop your own skills. So take a couple minutes and really observe there. And that's quite frankly, everything I had on the interpersonal communications level. It's truly, truly a piggyback to the EQ, to your emotional intelligence, and why that's so important in a workplace setting. And thank you all for joining me. And I don't know, were there any questions in the chat, or does anyone have any questions, concerns to the topic today?
Danielle, I haven't seen any questions, but as I wrap it up, definitely feel free to pop questions in. Lots of positive comments for you, though.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all for joining us today. As I mentioned at the start, we are recording today's session, and we will be posting that recording on the Women's Business Center's YouTube channel. I did share a link to our YouTube channel in the chat. So certainly pop that open and feel free to visit our YouTube channel. We did post last week's session on emotional intelligence. So certainly feel free to revisit that session as well. Next week, we will focus on vulnerability in leadership on Wednesday, May 26th at 10 a.m. I also shared the Eventbrite link if you'd like to go ahead and get registered for that. So feel free to visit the chat for both of those links. Danielle, thank you so much for your today and for this presentation. And I'm really looking forward to next week's session as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.